November 20th, 1992. It was supposed to be an ordinary Friday morning at Windsor Castle. Workers were restoring a chandelier in Queen Victoria's private chapel when a faulty spotlight pressed too close to a velvet curtain, which suddenly ignited. Within seconds, flames licked up the ancient fabric. Within minutes, they had spread to the wooden ceiling beams. By noon, 115 rooms were ablaze, and 15 hours later, the world watched in horror as 9 centuries of history burned before their eyes. But this wasn't the first time Windsor Castle faced destruction, and it wouldn't be the last time it rose from the ashes. This is the story of the world's largest inhabited castle, a fortress that has survived sieges, fires, civil wars, and 2 world wars, a home to 40 monarchs and a witness to 1,000 years of British history. To understand why Windsor Castle exists at all, we must travel back nearly 1,000 years to October 14th, 1066. On that autumn day, Duke William of Normandy defeated King Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, earning himself a new title, William the Conqueror. But winning a single battle didn't mean controlling an entire kingdom. The Anglo-Saxon population outnumbered William's Norman forces dramatically, and rebellions erupted across England like sparks from a forge. Lords who had pledged loyalty to Harold were about to bow to a foreign invader without a fight. William needed a strategy that would allow his small army to control a hostile land, and that strategy would be written in stone and timber across the English countryside. William's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Build a defensive ring of castles around London, the heart of his new kingdom. Each fortress would be positioned roughly 20 miles from the next, exactly 1 day's march for a medieval army. This meant that if any castle came under attack, reinforcements from neighboring fortresses could arrive within 24 hours. It was a medieval early warning system, a network of power that could respond to threats with devastating speed. 9 castles formed this protective ring, and among them Windsor would prove to be the most enduring. The location William chose for Windsor was no accident. The site sat atop a chalk cliff that rose dramatically above the River Thames, offering sweeping views in all directions. From this vantage point, sentries could spot approaching armies miles away. The Thames itself provided a natural moat on one side, while steep slopes assaulted from other directions posed a challenge. But Windsor's strategic value went beyond mere defensibility. It controlled the western approach to London, making it impossible for armies to march on the capital from that direction without first dealing with Windsor's garrison. Just as importantly, the site bordered Windsor Forest, thousands of acres of ancient woodland that Norman kings would soon claim as their private hunting ground. For medieval monarchs, hunting wasn't just a sport but a demonstration of power and a source of fresh meat for the royal table. Construction began around 1070, just 4 years after the Norman Conquest. But this first Windsor Castle bore little resemblance to the magnificent stone palace we see today. William's engineers employed the classic Norman design known as motte and bailey, a proven template that could be built quickly with minimal resources. The motte was an artificial hill, created by piling up the chalk that workers excavated from the surrounding ditch. This man-made mountain rose 50 feet into the air, a monument to Norman determination and Anglo-Saxon labor, because make no mistake, it was conquered English peasants who did the backbreaking work of moving thousands of tons of earth. Atop this chalk mound, carpenters erected a wooden keep, a square tower that served as the castle's ultimate refuge. If attackers breached the outer defenses, defenders could retreat to this elevated stronghold and continue their resistance. At the base of the motte lay 2 enclosures called baileys, one to the east and one to the west. These areas, known as the Upper Ward and Lower Ward, contained barracks for soldiers, stables for horses, workshops for blacksmiths and carpenters, and storage buildings for food and weapons. Wooden palisade walls, basically tall fences made from sharpened logs, surrounded the entire complex. Outside these walls, workers dug a deep ditch that served as the first line of defense. The entire fortress could be constructed in as little as 2 years, though Windsor took considerably longer, with work continuing until 1086. Here's a surprising fact that few people know: William the Conqueror did actually own the land on which Windsor Castle sits. He rented it from a Norman nobleman, and English monarchs wouldn't purchase Windsor outright until 1456, nearly 5 centuries after its construction. This wooden fortress was formidable by the standards of its day, but it was meant to be temporary, a placeholder until more permanent fortifications could be built. Over the next century, Windsor would undergo a transformation that would change it from a military outpost into a royal palace. From wooden walls to stone ramparts, from a temporary garrison to the permanent home of kings, that transformation would test the limits of medieval engineering, consume fortunes in gold, and create a building that would stand for a millennium. But before we explore how Windsor grew into the castle we know today, we need to understand what happened when those first stone walls faced their ultimate test in battle. The wooden castle William built served its purpose for nearly a century, but wood rots, wood burns, and wood can be chopped through with axes and battering rams. By the middle of the 12th century, England had a new king with grand ambitions and the resources to make them a reality. Henry II wasn't content with a simple military outpost. He envisioned Windsor as a palace worthy of the Plantagenet dynasty, and between 1165 and 1179, he would transform William's wooden fortress into something that could withstand the test of centuries. The first challenge facing Henry's engineers was replacing the wooden keep atop the moat with a stone structure. This presented an enormous problem that builders hadn't fully anticipated. Stone is vastly heavier than wood, and when they began laying the foundations for what would become known as the Round Tower, the foundations kept sinking into the chalk moat beneath. Remember, this wasn't solid bedrock but an artificial hill made from loose chalk excavated a century earlier. The solution required digging deeper, much deeper, until they finally reached the natural bedrock far below. Only then could they create a foundation solid enough to support the massive weight of a stone keep. This wasn't just a technical challenge but an architectural statement. Henry was quite literally building on firmer ground than his predecessors. Henry's vision extended beyond mere military necessity. He was the first monarch to truly use Windsor as a palace rather than just a fortress, and this meant creating spaces suitable for royal living. He ordered the construction of 2 separate sets of royal apartments, a revolutionary concept at the time. The public state residence in the lower ward was where Henry conducted official business, received ambassadors, and displayed the majesty of his court. The private residence in the upper ward offered the royal family sanctuary from the constant demands of rulership. The wooden palisade walls came down, replaced by stone curtain walls that would stand for centuries. These were on simple barriers, but sophisticated defensive structures featuring battlements where archers could rain arrows down on attackers while staying protected themselves. Arrow slits, those distinctive narrow windows you see in castle walls, were precisely engineered to allow defenders to shoot outward while presenting minimal target area to besiegers. The walls themselves were built using a technique that would become standard in medieval castle construction. Skilled masons cut and dressed large blocks of stone called ashlar for the outer and inner faces of the wall. Between these 2 stone skins, workers poured in rubble, smaller stones, and lime mortar, creating a wall that was both incredibly strong and somewhat flexible, able to absorb the impact of siege weapons without shattering. Then came the ultimate test. In 1215, King John, Henry's great-grandson, reneged on his promises in the Magna Carta, that famous document that limited royal power and guaranteed certain rights to English nobles. The barons rebelled, and in a move that shocked the kingdom, they invited Prince Louis of France to invade England and claim the throne. In June of 1216, a French army appeared before Windsor's walls with siege engines, battering rams and trebuchets, capable of hurling massive stones with devastating force. For 2 months, these siege weapons hammered Windsor's defenses. The thunder of stones striking walls echoed across the Thames Valley. Defenders under the command of Engelard de Signy fought desperately, knowing that if Windsor fell, London itself would be exposed. Day after day, the French assaulted the gates, attacked the walls, and attempted to undermine the foundations. But Henry's stone walls, those massive fortifications standing for meters thick, held firm. When King John died in October 1216, just months after the siege began, the rebellion collapsed, and the French withdrew. Windsor had passed its trial by fire, or rather, by stone and steel. The siege convinced Henry III, John's son, that Windsor needed even stronger defenses. He made the walls thicker still, expanding them to a staggering 7.3 meters, that's nearly 24 feet of solid stone, making them virtually impervious to any siege weapon of the age. He also added ingenious defensive features like sallyports, small hidden doors that allowed defenders to launch surprise counterattacks against besiegers, and secret tunnels through which troops could move unseen. But the most dramatic transformation of Windsor Castle came in the 14th century under Edward III. Born at Windsor in 1312, Edward held a deep emotional connection to the castle. He had grown up within its walls, played in its courtyards as a child, and witnessed his father Edward II's disastrous, weak reign end in forced abdication and probable murder. When Edward III came to power, he was determined to restore England's military prestige and create a court that would rival any in Europe. Between the 1350s and his death in 1377, Edward poured unprecedented resources into Windsor, essentially rebuilding the entire upper ward in the Gothic style. He hired William of Wykeham, who would later design New College, Oxford, and Winchester College, as his master architect. The project was breathtaking in scope and expense. Edward spent £50,000, an amount equivalent to more than £70 million today. Over $90 million in American dollars. To put this in perspective, this was more than Edward's entire annual income as king. It was the most expensive building project undertaken by any medieval English monarch, a statement of power and ambition carved in stone and mortar. Imagine for a moment that you could step through time and walk through Windsor Castle's gates on a typical day in the 14th century. The first thing that would strike you is not the grandeur or the military might, but the sheer number of people. Castles weren't lonely fortresses occupied only by a lord and a few guards. They were bustling communities, small towns enclosed within defensive walls, and Windsor was among the largest. On any given day. Between 30 and 150 people called Windsor home, though the number swelled dramatically during major feasts or royal gatherings. At the top of this social hierarchy sat the lord and lady, in Windsor's case, the King and Queen of England themselves. Below them came their children and extended family members. Then the knights sworn to royal service, and finally the enormous household staff that made castle life possible. A countess at Goodrich Castle employed nearly 100 servants, and Windsor, being a royal residence, would have required even more. Cooks and bakers were laboring over massive hearths, maids scrubbing floors and changing linens, stable hands caring for dozens of horses, blacksmiths forging everything from horseshoes to armor, carpenters maintaining the endless wooden structures within the stone walls, falconers training hawks for the hunt, and huntsmen managing the vast royal forest beyond the castle gates. But here's something that surprises most people about medieval castle life. These were permanent homes in the way we understand the concept today. Noble families practiced what historians call the moving household. The king, queen, and their entourage would spend a few weeks or months at Windsor, then pack up virtually everything they owned and move to another castle. Why such inconvenience? Partly it was about projecting royal power across the kingdom, showing the flag as it were, but there were practical reasons too. Medieval castles lacked refrigeration, and feeding a household of 100 people required enormous quantities of food. After a few months in one location, the surrounding countryside would be exhausted of supplies. The castle's stores would be depleted, and frankly, the place would start to smell. Moving to a fresh castle allowed the previous location to recover, restock, and thoroughly clean out months of accumulated waste. The rhythm of daily life at Windsor followed patterns established by necessity and reinforced by centuries of tradition. Dawn broke with the sharp blast of a trumpet from the battlements. The guards signaled that a new day had begun. Within minutes, the castle stirred to life. Servants hurried to light fires in the great kitchen and the hall, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Medieval castles weren't the perpetually freezing dungeons that movies would have us believe, but they certainly required effort to heat. Windsor eventually boasted over 300 fireplaces, and on cold mornings, all of them would be roaring. Lower-ranking household members ate a simple breakfast of bread and weak beer. Yes, beer, because water was often unsafe to drink, but the nobles wouldn't dine until later. The main meal of the day, called dinner, was served between 10 in the morning and noon. This was no quick affair but an elaborate production in the Great Hall, with multiple courses served to the high table where the royal family sat elevated above everyone else. The food would astonish modern sensibilities. A single feast might feature swans, peacocks, venison, wild boar, dozens of types of fish, exotic spices brought from the far reaches of the known world, and elaborate sugar sculptures crafted to resemble castles or ships. On Fridays and numerous other holy days throughout the year, religious observance demanded fish instead of meat. Records show that Goodrich Castle consumed 24,000 herrings in just 3 months, and Windsor's consumption would have been even greater. While servants prepared and served these elaborate meals, the nobility engaged in the business of ruling. The king met with advisors, settled legal disputes, planned military campaigns, and conducted diplomacy with foreign powers. But medieval noblewomen weren't passive observers in silk dresses. They wielded real power, managing castle operations, overseeing finances, and commanding respect from servants and soldiers alike. When their husbands were away at war, which happened frequently, these women became the castle's absolute authority. Afternoons often meant recreation, and for the nobility, that meant hunting. Windsor Forest provided endless opportunities for sport, and royal hunting parties would ride out with hawks on their wrists and hounds at their heels. Falconry was particularly prized, a skilled art that took years to master. The type of bird you were permitted to fly indicated your social rank. Kings flew gerfalcons, the largest and most powerful birds, while lower nobles had to content themselves with lesser species. As evening approached, a lighter meal called supper was served, followed by entertainment in the great hall. This is where castle life became truly spectacular because every single form of entertainment was live. There was no recorded music, no television, and no books for most people. Entertainment meant minstrels playing instruments and singing songs of courtly love or martial glory, jugglers keeping impossible numbers of objects airborne, acrobats performing feats of strength and flexibility, poets reciting epic verses from memory, and troubadours telling stories that had been passed down through generations. Dancing was common. Board games like chess and tables, an ancestor of backgammon, occupied quieter corners, and on special occasions, the castle might host a feast so elaborate it would be talked about for years. But even amid this grandeur, certain realities of medieval life couldn't be escaped. The toilets, called garter-robes, were simple wooden planks with holes cut in them, mounted over shafts that dropped waste directly outside the castle walls. Multiple people might use the same room simultaneously because medieval concepts of privacy were radically different from ours. And these rooms supposedly smelled so strongly that moths avoided them, which is why people stored clothes there. Hence the name garderobe, literally meaning guard clothes. Windsor Castle's stones have witnessed nearly 1,000 years of human drama, and among the countless stories etched into its history, some stand out for their strangeness, their tragedy, or their profound impact on the course of English history. Take, for example, the curious tale of King John II of France, who arrived at Windsor not as a conqueror, but as a prisoner, though you wouldn't know it from how he was treated. In 1356, at the Battle of Poitiers, English forces under the Black Prince, son of Edward III, achieved one of medieval warfare's most stunning upsets, capturing the King of France himself. John was brought to Windsor and held for ransom, but his captivity resembled a royal visit more than imprisonment. He lived in luxury, dined at the king's table, hunted in Windsor Forest, and was treated with the elaborate courtesy that medieval chivalry demanded for captured nobility. His ransom was set at 3 million gold crowns, an astronomical sum that would cripple the French economy for years. John eventually returned to France to raise the money, but when one of his sons, who had been left as collateral, escaped back to France, John voluntarily returned to English captivity because his honor demanded it. He died in London in 1364, still a prisoner, though one who had lived better than most free men. Another royal prisoner had an even longer stay. James I of Scotland was captured by the English in 1460 while sailing to France as a boy, and spent 18 years as a guest prisoner. The line was always blurry. At Windsor, during his captivity, he received an excellent education, learned to read and write in multiple languages, and developed into a poet of considerable skill. From a window at Windsor, he spotted Joan Beaufort walking in the gardens below and fell hopelessly in love. He wrote poetry about her, comparing her to a white falcon, and when he was finally ransomed in 1424, he married her and took her back to Scotland as his queen. Romance born from captivity, poetry written in a prison, a love story with a happy ending. Windsor provided the setting for it all, but not all of Windsor's prisoner stories end so pleasantly. During the Wars of the Roses, that brutal civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York, King Henry VI found himself imprisoned at Windsor by his Yorkist rival Edward IV. Henry, a gentle, pious man who had suffered from bouts of mental illness, was eventually murdered, probably on Edward's orders, and his body was buried at Windsor. The castle that had hosted such elaborate displays of chivalry and honor had also witnessed cold-blooded political murder, a reminder that medieval reality often fell far short of medieval ideals. Speaking of chivalry, we cannot discuss Windsor without addressing the Order of the Garter, the most prestigious knighthood in Britain. Founded at Windsor in 1348 by Edward III, legend tells us that, at a ball, a lady's garter, a piece of underwear, slipped off and fell to the floor. Courtiers laughed at her embarrassment, but Edward gallantly picked up the garter, tied it around his own leg, and declared in French, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame on him who thinks evil of it. He then founded an order of knighthood based on this incident, creating a chivalric society that would rival King Arthur's legendary Knights of the Round Table. The truth is probably less romantic. Edward was obsessed with Arthurian legend and wanted to create a real-world equivalent of the Round Table, a brotherhood of England's finest warriors bound by oaths of loyalty and honor. The Order of the Garter was limited to just 24 knights at any time, plus the sovereign, making membership extraordinarily exclusive. These knights had their headquarters in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, where their coat of arms was displayed above their designated stalls. When a knight died, his heraldic banner was removed, but a brass plate bearing his name and arms remained, creating a visual history of British nobility stretching back centuries. The order still exists today, and its annual ceremony at Windsor, with knights processing in their elaborate velvet robes and plumed hats, provides a living link to medieval pageantry. Windsor also played a pivotal role in England's darkest political crisis. During the English Civil War, when King and Parliament tore the nation apart in a conflict that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives, Windsor Castle became a parliamentary stronghold. In 1643, parliamentary forces seized Windsor from royalist control, and it remained in their hands throughout the war. When King Charles I was captured, he was brought to Windsor as a prisoner. From its windows he could see the kingdom he had lost, the throne he would never reclaim. After his trial and execution in 1549, the only British monarch ever legally executed for treason, his body was returned to Windsor and buried in St. George's Chapel beside Henry VIII, a king who had executed 2 of his own wives. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. Parliament then debated whether Windsor Castle itself should be demolished, viewing it as a symbol of royal tyranny. The vote was close, shockingly close, and Windsor survived by a narrow margin. Had a few more members of Parliament voted differently, the castle we know today would be nothing but ruins and historical footnotes. Even in the 20th century, Windsor continued its role as a fortress and refuge. During World War II, while German bombs fell on London, the young princesses Elizabeth and Margaret lived at Windsor, protected by its ancient walls, just as medieval children had been protected from attacking armies centuries before. The castle became a symbol of British continuity and resistance, standing firm while the world burned around it. The morning of November 20, 1992, began like any other at Windsor Castle. Workers were in the process of restoring Queen Victoria's private chapel, a delicate job that required bright lights and careful attention to detail. A spotlight was positioned near the altar, and at approximately 11:30, that spotlight, faulty and overheating, pressed too close to a heavy velvet curtain. The fabric caught fire. In those first crucial seconds, the fire was small, containable, the kind of minor accident that happens on renovation sites everywhere. But this was no ordinary building. Windsor Castle was filled with wood, ancient timbers that had been drying for centuries, wooden paneling, wooden floors, wooden ceiling beams, and wooden furniture. The fire spread with horrifying speed. Within minutes, flames had climbed the curtain and reached the wooden ceiling. Within a quarter hour, they had burst through into the roof space, where centuries of accumulated dust and bone-dried timber created perfect conditions for an inferno. By noon, St. George's Hall, that magnificent chamber where Edward III had once hosted the Knights of the Garter, was fully ablaze. The fire was now completely out of control. The emergency services responded with everything they had. Fire brigades from 7 different counties raced toward Windsor, their sirens wailing across the Berkshire countryside. Eventually, 225 firefighters would battle the blaze, supported by 36 fire pumps. They poured water onto the flames at an almost incomprehensible rate, ultimately using 1.5 million gallons, enough to fill 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. But the castle itself fought them at every turn. The maze of rooms and corridors created a labyrinth where fire could spread unseen. Thick stone walls and floors that had once protected against medieval siege engines now trapped heat and turned entire sections into massive ovens. Wooden roof beams, some of them 600 years old, burned like candles. The lead on the roof melted and ran down the walls in rivers of molten metal. Smoke so thick it could be seen from miles away billowed from every window. And still the fire advanced, room by room, consuming 900 years of history. But even as the castle burned, a different kind of battle was taking place inside. Staff members, construction workers, soldiers from the nearby garrison, and even Prince Andrew formed human chains, passing irreplaceable treasures hand to hand out of the fire's path. They worked in smoke so thick they could barely see, in heat so intense it blistered skin, racing against flames that pursued them through corridors and galleries. Paintings were torn from walls, furniture hauled through doorways, books snatched from shelves, tapestries pulled down and dragged to safety. 300 clocks, each one a masterpiece of horological art, were rescued. Thousands of books and manuscripts from the Royal Library were carried out. Priceless items from the royal collection, many of them irreplaceable, were evacuated room by room, piece by piece. It was heroic, desperate, and ultimately remarkably successful. By the time the fire was finally extinguished at 2:30 the following morning, after 15 hours of continuous burning, only 2 items of major significance had been lost: a large painting and a rosewood sideboard. Everything else, everything that could be moved, had been saved. But the building itself had suffered catastrophically. 115 rooms were destroyed. 9 staterooms were completely gutted. St. George's Hall, Where medieval knights had feasted and modern monarchs had hosted state banquets, was a blackened shell. The grand reception room, with its elaborate plasterwork and gilded decorations, was gone. The fire had caused damage that would take years to repair and cost tens of millions of pounds. For Queen Elizabeth II, the Windsor fire was the final disaster in what she would famously call her annus horribilis, her horrible year. 1992 had seen 3 royal marriages collapse. Prince Charles and Princess Diana separated. Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson divorced. Princess Anne's marriage ended. The media was relentlessly critical. Public opinion questioned the cost and relevance of the monarchy. And now, the Queen's beloved Windsor, her favorite residence, the place where she had spent so much of her life, was severely damaged. Then came the controversy that would dominate headlines for months. Windsor Castle was too valuable and too large to insure. The question everyone asked was simple: who would pay for the repairs? The initial assumption was that taxpayers would foot the bill, and public reaction was swift and furious. Why should ordinary citizens, many struggling with recession and unemployment, pay to restore a palace for one of the world's wealthiest families? The backlash forced a solution that would change the monarchy forever. Buckingham Palace, which had never been open to public tours, would open its doors for the first time in history. Entrance fees would fund 70% of the restoration. The Queen herself would contribute £2 million personally, and, in a move that shocked many, she agreed to pay income tax for the first time since the 1930s. The restoration became a project of intense national interest. Architects faced a delicate balance. Should they recreate exactly what had been lost, or should they take the opportunity to create something new? The decision was to do both. Some rooms were restored to their exact pre-fire condition using historical records and photographs. Others were redesigned, creating new spaces that honored the castle's history while adding modern elements. Where Queen Victoria's chapel had stood, architects created the Lantern Lobby, a stunning new room with a soaring ceiling. St. George's Hall was restored using traditional techniques, including a magnificent new hammer-beam oak roof crafted by hand. As the sun sets over Berkshire and Windsor Castle's towers cast long shadows across the Thames, it's worth pausing to consider the extraordinary journey this fortress has taken through time. For 952 years, these stones have stood witness to the full spectrum of human experience, from the brutal pragmatism of Norman conquest to the global media spectacle of modern royal weddings, from medieval siege warfare to 20th century world wars, from the desperate poverty of feudal peasants to the unimaginable wealth of successive royal dynasties. Windsor Castle is not merely a building but a chronicle written in stone and mortar. Each tower and wall a chapter in the ongoing story of Britain itself. When William the Conqueror's engineers first piled chalk into an artificial hill in the years after 1070, they were creating what they thought would be a temporary military outpost, a wooden fortress that would serve for a generation or two before being replaced or abandoned. They could never have imagined that nearly 1,000 years later, their humble motte would still stand at the heart of the world's largest inhabited castle. They could never have foreseen that their strategic choice of location would remain relevant through centuries of technological and social change, that the view they selected for its defensive advantages would one day be admired by millions of tourists, that the chalk cliff they chose above the Thames would support not just a military garrison but a palace that would host kings and queens for a millennium. Windsor's transformation from wooden fort to stone fortress to Gothic palace mirrors England's own evolution from a conquered territory to a medieval kingdom to a global empire, and finally to a modern constitutional monarchy. Each generation of builders and rulers left its mark. Henry II transformed a military outpost into a royal residence. Edward III created a cathedral to chivalry and knightly virtue. Charles II added Baroque elegance after the austere years of parliamentary rule. George IV brought the romantic Gothic revival. Queen Victoria made it her favorite refuge from the burdens of empire. And through it all, the castle adapted, survived, and endured. It withstood the only medieval siege mounted against its walls, held firm when Parliament debated its demolition during the Civil War, served as a symbol of resistance during 2 world wars, and rose from the ashes after the devastating fire of 1992. But perhaps Windsor's most remarkable quality isn't its military might or architectural grandeur, but its continued relevance. This is not a museum, not a relic preserved in amber for tourists to admire and then forget. Windsor Castle remains a working royal residence, home to the British monarch, hosts to state ceremonies and official functions. When world leaders visit Britain, they are often entertained at Windsor. When royal weddings occur, they frequently take place in St. George's Chapel, the same building where Edward III founded the Order of the Garter in 1348. The same chapel where Harry VIII was buried alongside Charles I now holds the tombs of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. Walk through Windsor's staterooms today, and you'll find them decorated for modern receptions, not preserved as historical artifacts. The castle lives and breathes and continues to evolve. This continuity is rare and precious. Most medieval castles are ruins now, roofless shells inhabited only by birds and memories. Those that survive intact are usually museums, their rooms roped off, their functions purely historical. But Windsor bridges past and present in a way few buildings anywhere in the world can match. Stand in the lower ward and you can see the artificial mark that Norman laborers piled up nearly 1,000 years ago. Enter St. George's Hall and you walk beneath the hammer beam ceiling installed after the 1992 fire. A ceiling crafted using medieval techniques but existing in the 21st century. Look at the paintings on the walls and you'll see portraits spanning 5 centuries of monarchy. The layers of history don't conflict but complement each other, each era adding to rather than erasing what came before. There's a lesson in Windsor's longevity that extends beyond architecture or royal history. The castle has survived because it has adapted. When wooden fortifications proved insufficient, they became stone. When pure military function became less important than royal comfort, it became a palace. When the 1992 fire destroyed over 100 rooms, it was rebuilt, not as a frozen historical recreation but as a living, evolving space that honored tradition while embracing necessary change. Rigidity leads to irrelevance and eventual destruction. Flexibility, the willingness to evolve while maintaining core identity, enables survival across centuries. As we leave Windsor behind and prepare to explore other castles in future episodes, remember this. Every stone here has a story, every tower witnessed moments of triumph and tragedy, every room once echoed with the voices of people who lived, loved, fought, and died within these walls. They were as real as we are, their hopes and fears as urgent, their lives as meaningful. The gap of centuries makes them seem distant, almost mythical, but they were human beings who happened to live in a different time. Windsor Castle connects us to them, bridges the gap between their world and ours, and reminds us that we are part of a story much larger than our individual lives. Today, Windsor Castle sprawls across 13 acres, contains approximately 1,000 rooms, and remains the largest inhabited castle in the world. The changing of the guard still takes place in its courtyards with the same pageantry that medieval soldiers would recognize. Even if the uniforms have changed, the state apartments still host banquets where world leaders dine beneath paintings collected by kings who ruled centuries ago. St. George's Chapel still holds services, its choir singing hymns in a building that has echoed with sacred music since the 15th century. And somewhere in the private apartments, beyond the reach of tourists and cameras, the royal family still calls Windsor home, just as 40 monarchs before them have done. The castle that began as a simple wooden fort built by a foreign conqueror has become a symbol of British continuity, a physical manifestation of history that refuses to remain in the past. It has survived everything history could throw at it. Civil wars that tore the nation apart, religious upheavals that redrew the map of faith, fires that consumed over 100 rooms, and the slow grinding passage of nearly 1,000 years. And it stands still, its towers and walls a testament to human ambition, architectural skill, and the stubborn determination of each generation to preserve what previous generations built. Windsor Castle isn't just history preserved. Its history is still being written, still unfolding, still adding new chapters to a story that began in the shadow of the Norman Conquest and continues in our own time. From William the Conqueror to King Charles III, from wooden palisades to Gothic towers, from medieval siege to modern tourism, this is Windsor Castle. This is 1,000 years of British history, contained within 13 acres of stone and mortar. And the story, remarkably, is far from over. If you found this journey through a millennium of history compelling, I invite you to join us for the next chapter in our exploration of Britain's most fascinating castles. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because next time, we venture into the shadows of the Tower of London, where 2 young princes mysteriously vanished, where Anne Boleyn walked to her execution, where the crown jewels are guarded, and where ravens still patrol the walls because legend says that if they ever leave, the kingdom itself will fall. The Tower of London awaits, and its secrets are darker and more intriguing than you can imagine. Until then, keep exploring history, keep asking questions, and remember that every castle has a story worth telling.